Good evening, friends. Thank you for joining me here once again. If you've been walking with me through these stories, you already know they're never just mine. They're lessons about family sacrifice and truth. If you're new, welcome. I hope you'll stay subscribed and share your own reflections in the comments. This community we're building is proof that stories can still bring people together even across miles. Tonight's story is called The Scholarship He Never Took. I'll never forget that dinner. The chandelier above our table flickered, like it couldn't decide whether to burn bright or give up. Shadows swayed across the walls, and the steady clink of forks against porcelain filled the silences between us. The wine in my glass smelled sharper than usual, bitter, almost medicinal, as though even it had caught the tension in the air. My daughter sat across from me, her back straight, her chin lifted in that way she does when she thinks she's about to deliver wisdom. She glanced briefly at the papers in her lap, then at her husband beside her before finally letting her eyes rest on me. "Dad," she said, her voice crisp, rehearsed, "it's time to sell the company. We need a better life." The words landed like a blow I never saw coming. My hand froze halfway to my mouth. The spoon in my fingers quivered, sending a tremor of broth back into the bowl. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the uneven buzzing of that fickle chandelier. "Sell the company," I repeated, though my throat was dry, the syllables scraping like sandpaper. "Yes," she replied, impatient already. "This place, it's outdated. Your methods, your leadership. We could use the money for new opportunities to finally move forward. Don't you see you've been holding us back? Holding them back." I set the spoon down carefully, though my fingers wanted to slam it onto the table. Across from me, her eyes didn't soften, they gleamed. Pride, ambition, arrogance even. She looked at me the way I once looked at men too stubborn to admit their time had passed. For an instant, my wife's face appeared in my memory, framed in the steam of the soup. Evelyn, with her quiet strength, the one who'd stayed awake with me through sleepless nights when bills outnumbered paychecks. The woman who'd whispered into our daughter's ear, "Your father is building this for you." Now that same daughter sat there, dismissing it all as nothing but dead weight. I swallowed hard, but the lump in my throat wouldn't move. The table felt suddenly foreign. The soft scraping of knives, the wine glasses catching fractured light, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Ordinary sounds, but now they mocked me. I searched her face, hoping to find some trace of the little girl who used to climb onto my shoulders, who once clapped her hands when I surprised her with ice cream after school. Instead, I saw someone else, entirely polished, sharp-edged, convinced she was right. And then, as if the air hadn't already been sucked out of the room, her little boy piped up. "My grandson." His voice was innocent, his words pure repetition. "Daddy said Grandpa's selling the company," he chirped, swinging his legs under the table. "Grandpa's leaving, right?" That was the cut that went deepest. The spoon clattered against the rim of my bowl as I pulled back my hand, and I had to grip my knees under the table to keep them from shaking. The child didn't know, he couldn't know the meaning of what he'd said. He was just parroting as children do. But the sound of it echoed like betrayal made flesh. "Grandpa's leaving." I felt my chest tighten, and for a long moment I could only stare at the flickering chandelier light, as though searching for guidance in its indecision. "Stay bright, burn out," my daughter sipped her wine as if nothing seismic had just been spoken. My son-in-law adjusted his tie, satisfied, like a deal was already signed. And the little boy, my grandson, returned to poking at his mashed potatoes, unaware of the dagger he'd driven clean through me. I sat there silent, but inside old memories began to stir. Images of sacrifice choices I'd made long before she ever dreamed of a better life. The nights I worked 2 jobs. The tuition payments. The endless bills. The faith that someday she would understand. Now all of it seemed to dissolve under the harsh glow of that single moment. She wanted to sell the company, to erase the very foundation, laid brick by brick, dollar by dollar, sacrifice by sacrifice. And me, I was supposed to nod, to agree, to accept that the sum of a lifetime's work could be reduced to outdated. I clenched my jaw until it ached, staring at the glass of red wine in front of me, the bitter scent curling up like smoke, Across from me, she was already looking ahead to her imagined future. But I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. That was the night I first realized some truths can't be sold, no matter the price. I barely touched the rest of my food that night. The soup cooled in its bowl, the steam fading as though it too had lost the will to rise. My daughter's words lingered in the air longer than the smell of garlic bread or the faint tang of wine. Sell the company. Move on. You're holding us back. Long after the dishes were cleared, after my grandson had been tucked into bed upstairs, I sat in my chair by the window watching the street lamp flicker against the leaves. My hands were folded tight in my lap, but I could still feel the tremor from earlier, the spoon rattling against porcelain, as if announcing to everyone in the room that I had been blindsided. I thought back to the winter 25 years earlier, when the company was nothing more than a rented office above a hardware store. I had sold my truck, my only truck, to buy the first round of equipment. Evelyn had stood beside me in that tiny office holding coffee in a paper cup, her eyes lit with belief. She said, "Max, this will be the roof over her head one day." And it was. The company kept a roof-bought book, sent our daughter to college. But memory can be cruel. Tonight, those words were drowned out by a new voice, sharp and dismissive. Outdated. Holding us back. I rubbed my temple, feeling a dull ache. It wasn't just about money. It was about erasure. The living room clock ticked. Each second, louder, heavier. I remembered the sacrifices stacked like bricks, each one a foundation stone she now wanted to bulldoze. When she was 12, Evelyn and I scraped together what we had to buy her: a clarinet. She wanted to join the school band. We ate rice and beans for 3 weeks so she could have that instrument. She played squeaky notes for months, filling our house with sound. I still have that clarinet in the attic. And then years later, at her high school graduation, she clutched her diploma and turned to us, tears shining in her eyes. She said, "I couldn't have done this without you." I believed her. I wanted to. But tonight the same lips spoke something colder: "We need a better life." As if the one we gave her was never enough. I pressed my palms into my knees, grounding myself in the silence of the house. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked, the sound of her moving about, perhaps telling her husband what she thought was a victory speech. I pictured him nodding in agreement, reinforcing her conviction that selling the company was the answer. My gaze drifted to Evelyn's photograph on the mantel. She wore that blue dress, the one with white trim, her hair caught in a wind I could almost feel again. I whispered, "Did we do this wrong? Did we raise her to think money was the only measure?" The photo, of course, didn't answer. But in my chest, something heavy shifted. It wasn't guilt. It was resolve. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes. I saw the office again, saw the long nights when Evelyn packed sandwiches so I wouldn't starve at my desk, saw the ledger where every dollar was stretched to cover tuition, rent, payroll. That company wasn't a burden. It was our story. My story. Evelyn's story. And even if my daughter refused to see it, I would not let her rewrite it. The words from dinner replayed in my head like a broken record: "Sell the company." Outdated. Holding us back. And then my grandson's innocent echo: "Grandpa's leaving." No, I thought. Grandpa's not leaving. Not yet. The street outside grew darker, the lamp finally giving up its flicker and plunging the block into stillness. I sat alone, Evelyn's memory beside me, my chest rising and falling with a steadier rhythm now. The betrayal had pierced me, but beneath the wound the old fire began to stir. I had built too much sacrifice too deeply to let it all be sold off like scrap. If they wanted to fight, they would find out soon enough that I wasn't done fighting. I didn't sleep much that night. The clock glowed past midnight, then 1, then 2. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard her voice again, clipped and certain: "Dad, it's time to sell the company." I saw the way her eyes hardened, how she didn't flinch when my hand trembled. It wasn't just a passing thought. She had made up her mind, and she believed it was her right to say it. By morning, I was back at the office. The familiar creak of the wooden steps leading up to the second floor greeted me like an old friend. The building itself smelled faintly of sawdust and ink, a scent that had never really left since the early days. I unlocked the door, the same brass key I'd been carrying for 3 decades, turning in the lock. For a moment, I just stood there breathing in the quiet. The office walls were lined with photographs, not just of projects we had completed, but of people, employees, families, the crew celebrating milestones. Evelyn used to pin them up saying, "This isn't just business, Max. This is family." I touched one of the frames. The men in the picture had long since retired, but the smiles were still young, filled with the pride of work done well. Sitting at my desk, I flipped through old ledgers, the ink faded but legible. There it was, the tuition checks, the payroll advances, the loans repaid late, because I chose to cover someone else's medical bill first. Evelyn and I had turned sacrifice into routine. Each line was proof that this company wasn't just numbers. It was the thread holding dozens of lives together. And yet my daughter wanted to reduce it to a sale. A better life, she called it. I couldn't stop thinking about those words. Better compared to what the roof over her head, the diploma on her wall, the security she never lacked. I remembered a cold January morning when she was still in high school. The furnace had given out, and the house was freezing. I bundled her in every blanket we had, then spent half the day fixing it myself using money I should have sent to suppliers. That week, I worked 18 hours a day to catch up. She had walked into the kitchen one morning, hair a mess, holding a mug of hot cocoa, and whispered, "Thanks, Dad." That whisper had kept me going more than the paychecks. Now I wondered if she remembered it at all. A knock pulled me from my thoughts. It was Henry, one of the oldest employees, still with me. His hands were calloused, his back bent from years of labor, but his eyes carried the same respect they always had. He stepped inside quietly, holding a cup of coffee. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said. I managed a small smile. "You're observant." He studied me for a moment, then asked something happened at home. I hesitated. Henry had been there since the first warehouse contract. He knew Evelyn knew our family knew more than most. Maybe that was why I let the word slip. "My daughter thinks it's time to sell." Henry frowned. "Sell after everything?" I nodded. "She says, we need a better life." For a moment the room was quiet except for the hum of the old radiator. Then Henry set the coffee down and placed his rough hand on my shoulder. "Max, this place is the better life. We built it. You gave her everything because of it. Don't let her forget that." His words echoed the ones Evelyn might have spoken. For the first time since last night, my chest loosened. I wasn't alone in remembering what this company truly was. After he left, I sat back, staring at the walls, the pictures, the ledgers. Each memory surged like a tide, every sacrifice, every late night, every whispered thank you. They had once been bricks in a foundation, but now they were stones in my armor. If my daughter was determined to erase the story of this company, then I would have to remind her of the truth. Not just with words, but with proof. With something undeniable. I closed the ledger and locked it away. My hand rested on the drawer a moment longer than necessary, the way a soldier might linger over his gear before battle. Because that's what this was becoming, a battle not of fists or guns, but of memory against ambition, sacrifice against greed. And I wasn't about to lose. The next morning, sunlight streamed weakly through the kitchen blinds, dust floating in the golden beams like restless ghosts. I sat with a cup of black coffee, but it tasted more bitter than usual, even though I hadn't changed the brand in years. My daughter walked in her heels, clicking against the tile with the confidence of someone already halfway out the door. She didn't notice the way my eyes followed her, or maybe she did and chose to ignore it. She glanced at her phone, thumbs moving quickly across the screen. "I'm meeting with an investment group later today," she said casually, as if she were talking about picking up groceries. I lowered my cup slowly. Investment group about the company. She finally looked at me, her expression sharp, impatient. "Yes, Dad. About the company. They've shown interest. We can liquidate cash out and secure something better for the family. For once, we can live without worry." Her words felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced them in a mirror. I noticed the faint flicker of her eyes toward the dining room, where Evelyn's picture still hung in its frame. Maybe she thought invoking the family would soften the blow. But instead, it twisted the knife. My spoon trembled against the ceramic saucer as I set it down. Do you even know what it took to build this place? My voice cracked softer than I intended. Do you remember those years when your mother worked nights and I slept on job sites so the crews had heat in the morning? Do you remember me selling the car just to keep your tuition paid? She sighed, exasperated, as though I were recounting ancient history. Dad, you're stuck in the past. None of that matters now. What matters is opportunity. We can move forward. We deserve more. Her phone buzzed again, and without waiting for my response, she picked up her purse and left the house. The door clicked shut, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than any argument. I sat for a long while, staring at Evelyn's picture. Her eyes frozen in that photograph seemed to plead with me to remember why we did all of it. She had always said the company was our second child, the one we raised together with sweat and long nights. To her, it was never about money, it was about meaning. And now the daughter we raised with that very meaning wanted to erase it all for cash. Later that afternoon, I drove out to the old factory site on the edge of town. The building had been repainted since we sold it, but I could still see the ghosts of our work etched into the beams. I parked and walked slowly along the chain-link fence, remembering the first contract we had won there. The year was 1993. We were broke, exhausted, but proud. Evelyn brought sandwiches for the crew, and my daughter, barely 10 years old, then handed out water bottles to the men, laughing when they lifted her onto their shoulders. That memory felt like another lifetime, almost like a dream. My hand clenched the fence as if holding on to it might pull the past closer. The sound of metal creaking under my grip echoed in the empty yard. The world had changed. My daughter had changed. But I hadn't. And maybe that was the problem, or maybe it was the only thing keeping me grounded. On the drive back, I thought of something Henry had said to me yesterday. Don't let her forget. Those words rattled inside me like stones in a jar. He was right. She needed to be reminded of what this company meant, not just to me, but to everyone who had ever walked through its doors. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed the porch light flicker as if the house itself were wary of this battle. I sat in the car, engine off, listening to the ticking of cooling metal. My reflection in the windshield looked older than I remembered, lines etched deeper, eyes heavier. But beneath the fatigue there was resolve. If my daughter wanted to sit at tables with investors and talk about liquidation, then I would gather a different kind of table, a table of memory, truth, and sacrifice. I wasn't sure how yet, but I knew this fight was only beginning, and I was ready to meet it no matter how much it hurt. That night the house felt too quiet, as if every corner were listening. I sat at my desk, Evelyn's photo propped beside a lamp that cast a tired glow over scattered papers. My daughter's words echoed in my head, we can liquidate. We deserve more. Each syllable scraped against me like sandpaper. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a worn leather folder I hadn't touched in years. Inside were old receipts, letters, and contracts, reminders of the years when survival had meant sacrifice. One document caught my eye, the tuition bill from her sophomore year at college. I remembered the night I signed that check. It was winter. The pipes at the plant had frozen, and I had been working 16-hour shifts just to keep operations running. My fingers were still numb when I filled in the amount, more money than I had in my account at the time. I sold my truck the very next day to cover it. That truck had been my pride, a rust-red Ford I'd rebuilt with my own hands. But it became tuition. My daughter never knew. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me. The sound of its blades was uneven, squeaking every third rotation, like a reminder that time itself was limping forward. My hand trembled slightly as I placed the bill on the desk next to Evelyn's picture. The following morning, I drove to the old archives room at the office. Dust clung to the cabinets and the fluorescent lights flickered weakly overhead. I pulled open drawers stuffed with yellowing files, each folder holding fragments of a story no investor would ever care about. Pay stubs from the early years when I'd worked without salary to keep the company afloat. Hospital bills from when Evelyn was sick, each one paid because the men on the floor needed insurance too. I laid them out across the desk, a mosaic of sacrifice. Henry walked in quietly, coffee in hand. Couldn't sleep either, he asked, his voice low. I shook my head. She thinks it's just a company. Numbers on a page. She doesn't see the lives it carried. He studied the documents spread before us, then placed his hand gently on the tuition bill. Maybe it's time she did. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I listened to the hum of the lights, the distant groan of the building settling. My chest felt heavy, not with anger, but with something colder, sharper. Betrayal wasn't loud, it was quiet like the steady drip of a faucet wearing a hole in steel. Later that day, I sat alone in the break room, watching the steam rise from a cup of tea Evelyn used to drink. Chamomile faintly floral, carrying her memory in the scent. Around me, the chatter of younger employees buzzed new hires who had no idea how close the company had once come to collapse or who had saved it. Their laughter made me smile for a moment. Then I wondered what would happen to them if the company were sold. Would the investors keep them? Or would they cut costs, strip the place bare, and toss them aside like yesterday's tools? My daughter's voice replayed in my head bright and cold. We need a better life? Better than what? Better than the roof over her head, the education she received, the meals Evelyn and I skipped so she could eat my fists, tightened around the cup until it rattled against the saucer. That night back at home, I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow pad and a pen. I began to write not for her yet, but for myself. A list of every sacrifice Evelyn and I had made. Each line carried weight, sold the truck, took overtime for 6 months straight, paid medical bills for her classmates' surgery when their family couldn't. The list grew longer, spilling across the page like a confession. By the time I set the pen down, the tea had gone cold, but my heart beat with a strange steadiness. This wasn't just about saving a company. This was about reminding my daughter who she was and where she came from. If she had forgotten, then I would make her remember. One way or another. The next evening, the house carried a fragile calm, one that felt more like silence before a storm than peace. I had set the dinner table, the way Evelyn used to silverware polished napkins, folded her favorite china plates, glowing faintly under the soft chandelier. My daughter walked in confident, in her stride a folder of papers tucked beneath her arm. I could tell she was ready for another argument before we had even said grace. She placed the folder directly beside her plate, the edge of it brushing against the candle I had lit. The flame flickered, throwing her shadow across the tablecloth. She didn't bother with small talk. "Dad," she said, her tone clipped, "I've scheduled a meeting with some investors tomorrow. They're interested in buying. This could be the chance we've been waiting for." I felt the weight of the words settle into the room. My spoon trembled in my hand, clinking against the edge of the bowl. The soup was hot, but I could barely taste it. Bitterness coated my tongue. I looked at her face, searching for some trace of the little girl who used to run into my arms after soccer games, hair tangled, and eyes full of gratitude. Instead, I saw someone hardened by ambition, lips pressed into a line of impatience. For a long moment, I said nothing. I let the sound of the clock fill the silence, each tick heavy as a hammer. Finally, I spoke. "You think life is just numbers on a page? You forget what built those numbers." She rolled her eyes, leaning back in her chair. "Dad, I'm not forgetting. I'm moving forward. The company can't stay in the past forever. We could have everything: travel, comfort, security." Her voice sharpened on that last word, as if security was something she had never known. But hadn't I spent decades making sure she always had it? A memory rose unbidden. Evelyn and I late at night in the old kitchen, counting every dollar in a tin box just to pay her tuition bill. My daughter had never seen that. She had only seen the results: the dorm room, the textbooks, the campus life. She hadn't seen her mother crying quietly over the grocery list, crossing out things we couldn't afford so tuition would be covered. I swallowed hard, setting the spoon down with deliberate care. My hands rested on the table, open palms up, as if I were laying my life out for her to see. "Do you know what it cost? Every late night, every piece of myself poured into this company, every sacrifice your mother and I made. It wasn't for me. It was for you." Her gaze flickered just slightly, but pride held her jaw firm. "That's the past, Dad. You can't expect me to carry your burdens forever." The words sliced through me, sharper than any blade. I glanced at Evelyn's empty chair at the table, imagining her there listening, heartbroken. I closed my eyes for a moment, steadying myself against the wave of pain. When I opened them again, my daughter was sipping her wine as if nothing she had said required second thought. The candle between us burned lower wax, spilling slowly down the side. I felt a heaviness in my chest, but alongside it a resolve was forming. If she could forget, I could remind. And if she refused to see, then I would make her see. That night after she left the table, I lingered in the dining room. The smell of soup had cooled into something faint and stale. I ran my fingers along the rim of Evelyn's chair, then let my hand rest there a moment longer than necessary. She's lost her way, I whispered into the silence. But I'll find a way to bring her back, or at least to the truth. Upstairs in the quiet of my study, I pulled the yellow pad closer, continuing the list of sacrifices. Each entry was a memory sharpened into a weapon, and as I wrote, I felt less like a man clinging to the past, and more like a father preparing for the reckoning that was to come. I sat in my study that night, the house wrapped in the kind of silence that presses on your ears until you hear nothing but your own heartbeat. The yellow pad lay open before me, the ink of my handwriting dark against the paper. I traced the words I had written in earlier chapters of my life: sacrifices made, debts paid, corners cut so she could have every opportunity. Yet one line kept circling in my mind: tuition. There was something about it I couldn't shake. I pulled open the bottom drawer of my desk, where I kept old files neatly stacked but rarely touched. Folders marked with Evelyn's careful handwriting, insurance, utilities, receipts for repairs on the old house. The smell of paper, slightly musty, rose up, carrying me back to years when every bill had to be counted twice. My fingers shook slightly as I sifted through until I found the folder I wanted: college records. The invoices were there, stamped PAID. Tuition statements in my daughter's name, dates neatly filed in chronological order. But tucked between them, almost as if it had slipped there by accident, was a single receipt printed on thinner paper. It was from a scholarship foundation. Anonymous donor, it read at the top, with 4 years of tuition listed beneath each one, marked with a zero balance. My breath caught. I remembered the night I had wired that money, choosing anonymity because I wanted her to believe she'd earned it. I wanted her to feel proud, unburdened by the knowledge that her father had bled himself dry just to give her freedom. Now, in the quiet of my study, the truth weighed heavier than ever. She sat at my table today, declaring she wanted to sell the company, forgetting what had carried her through those university gates. She didn't even know she hadn't walked through them on her own. I closed my eyes and saw Evelyn again. She had been the one to urge me to keep the gift anonymous. "She'll never appreciate it if she thinks she didn't earn it," she had said softly, resting her tired head against my shoulder. "Let her think the world gave her this chance. We'll know the truth." And we did. But the cost of that silence was echoing now in her arrogance, her blindness to sacrifice. The room felt colder. I pushed the chair back and stood, the wooden legs scraping against the floor with a low groan. I paced, my steps heavy against the carpet, the shadows shifting on the walls as the desk lamp flickered faintly. My chest ached with a mixture of anger and grief. I thought about her words again: we need a better life. As if the life we had given her, built with calloused hands and sleepless nights, had been nothing more than a placeholder. I picked up the receipt again, smoothing the creases as if holding it tighter would press back the years. The weight of my decision to keep it hidden now seemed foolish. She needed to see this. She needed to know the truth. It wasn't just numbers and signatures, it was her father's very marrow, poured into a future she now wished to discard. I turned toward the shelf where Evelyn's photograph rested, framed in simple oak. Her smile, soft and knowing, seemed to shine even in the dim light. "I can't let her sell it, Ev," I whispered hoarsely. "I can't let her erase everything we built. She has to understand what it cost. And if she won't, then I'll show everyone else." My hand lingered on the frame, then dropped to my side with resolve. Tomorrow I would start gathering what I needed: records, witnesses, every scrap of evidence that told the story of sacrifice. The scholarship wasn't just a forgotten receipt. It was a key. And keys, I knew, could unlock more than doors. They could open eyes. I sat back down, pen poised over the yellow pad once more. I wrote 3 words at the top of the page: show the truth. The ink bled slightly into the paper fibers, as if determined to stay. I underlined it twice. then closed the pad with a firm hand. For the first time in weeks, my heart steadied. The plan was no longer forming, it had begun. The next morning carried a chill sharper than I expected for late spring. I walked down the old main street toward the university where my daughter had spent 4 years of her life, 4 years she believed had been carried by her own merit. The receipt in my pocket weighed more than coins, more than stone. It felt like a piece of my very heart folded into paper. I knew where I had to go. There was a man older than me, even who had been there from the beginning. He had taught me when I was young, guided me when the business was nothing more than a dream scribbled on a napkin. He was also the one who had administered that scholarship fund back when Evelyn whispered that I should remain anonymous. I found him in his office books stacked like bricks around the walls, sunlight filtering through blinds that had seen better days. The smell of coffee lingered in the air mixed with dust and the faint trace of chalk. He looked up when I knocked, his eyes lighting with recognition. "Max," he said warmly, standing slower than he used to, but still with that steady grace. "It's been years." "What brings you here?" I hesitated, then pulled the folded receipt from my jacket and placed it gently on his desk. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the page, and when his eyes lifted back to mine, there was no need for explanation. "You finally want her to know," he murmured. His words were not a question, but a truth spoken aloud. I sat down heavily across from him. "She's trying to sell the company to erase everything Evelyn and I built. She doesn't remember. Or maybe she never knew. I thought giving in silence would protect her pride. Now it feels like that silence has robbed her of gratitude." He nodded slowly, fingers tapping the receipt. "I remember the night you came to me with that check. You looked me straight in the eye and said, 'Don't put my name on it. Let her believe it was a gift from the world so she walks taller.' I admired you for that, Max. But sacrifices hidden too long can grow into shadows. She doesn't see what you carried." The words cut deep because I knew he was right. My chest tightened as I thought of Evelyn again, her insistence that secrecy was the better gift. My daughter had grown in that shadow, proud but blind. I leaned forward, voice low but steady. "I need your help. I need you to stand with me when the time comes to confirm this scholarship wasn't random generosity, but the choice of a father who gave everything. She won't listen to me alone. But if you speak," he didn't hesitate, "you have my word. The truth should not die in these files. If the girl you raised has forgotten the weight you carried, then she must be reminded kindly but firmly." His hand rested briefly on mine, warm and reassuring. I left his office with the receipt tucked safely back in my jacket, but now it carried more than proof. It carried a witness. The street outside hummed with students laughing, rushing to classes, backpacks bouncing on their shoulders. I watched them and thought of my daughter at their age, eyes bright with dreams, believing the world had bent in her favor. She never saw the nights I worked until dawn, the blood on my hands from labor, the empty spaces in my wallet. As I walked away, I could almost hear Evelyn's voice in the wind, soft and knowing. "She will learn, Max. One way or another she will learn." The shadows of sacrifice had been too quiet for too long. Now step by step I was bringing them into the light. That evening the house felt colder than usual, though the thermostat hadn't changed. I sat at the dining table with the receipt folded neatly beside my plate, the memory of my meeting with the professor still pressing against my chest. My daughter entered, late heels clicking sharply against the wood floor, her perfume arriving before she did. She didn't look tired. She looked triumphant, as if every conversation she'd had that day had gone her way. She slid into the chair opposite me, scrolling her phone before setting it down with a sigh of satisfaction. "Dad," she began, voice smooth, "I've spoken with 2 potential buyers. They're serious. This could change everything for us. A clean break from the weight of the past." The word weight lingered in the air, heavy and insulting. I pressed my spoon into the soup, watching ripples move across the surface, and tried to keep my hand from trembling. My throat tightened. "You think the company is a weight?" I asked, forcing calm. She leaned back, eyes sharp. "It's old, Dad. Outdated. You built it in a different world. I want freedom, not change." Why should we keep grinding when we could cash out and live better? My chest burned. I heard Evelyn's laughter in memory the nights she carried coffee to my workshop, whispering encouragement while I drafted designs by hand. Every bolt, every beam, every brick had been a promise to my family. To hear it dismissed as a burden cut deeper than any blade. I looked at her and said quietly, "You forget what it took to give you choices. You forget the nights I worked through pain so you'd never feel it. Even your education," I stopped myself, words threatening to spill before the time was right. My fingers brushed the folded receipt. She wasn't ready. Not yet. She crossed her arms, lips curling with impatience. "I earned my place, Dad. My degree, my achievements, those are mine. You can't take that from me, and you can't stop progress. The company will sell with or without your blessing." Her words rang like a verdict. The chandelier above us flickered slightly, shadows sliding across her face. And for a moment I didn't see the little girl who once clung to my hand. I saw a stranger who spoke in terms of transactions and upgrades, blind to the roots beneath her own feet. I swallowed the ache in my throat. "Be careful," I murmured, more to myself than to her. "When you forget the foundation, the house above it doesn't stand long." She rolled her eyes, dismissing me like an old man muttering fables, and reached for her phone again. The clink of her bracelet against the glass table was louder than it should have been. Silence filled the room. I sat motionless, heart pounding, staring at the evidence I still kept hidden. The professor's words echoed: "Sacrifices left in shadow can grow into resentment." She was living proof. That night, when she had gone upstairs, and the house lay quiet again, I unfolded the receipt under the lamp's pale glow. Evelyn's handwriting on the old check memo still read for her future. My hands shook as I traced the ink. My daughter wanted to erase that future to trade it for a quicker life. But the truth would come. And when it did, she would see me not as an anchor holding her back, but as the foundation that had carried her forward all along. The morning light streamed weakly through the curtains, but I barely noticed. Sleep had been broken restless, with Evelyn's voice echoing in my head, reminding me of promises I had made and the sacrifices she had shared. I rose before dawn, poured black coffee into the chipped mug she had once chosen, and opened the drawer where I kept the older files. Dust rose as if the past itself resisted being uncovered. Inside were records, loan agreements I had signed alone, medical bills paid without complaint, tuition checks I had mailed with trembling hands but steady resolve. Each paper carried the weight of nights spent bent over ledgers, calculating what could be spared so that my daughter never knew the word less. By mid-morning, I was at the college, once again standing in the hallway outside the administration office. The linoleum floor gleamed, the faint scent of disinfectant clinging to the air. Students brushed past with backpacks slung over their shoulders, laughter bubbling between them. Their youth was a sharp reminder of what had been bought with years of my labor. The professor I had spoken with earlier greeted me kindly, his eyes soft with recognition. "Mr. Thompson, you're back." He guided me into his office walls, lined with books, the air heavy with paper and ink. I laid the receipt gently on his desk. "Do you remember this?" I asked. He studied it, then nodded. "Yes. I told you it was an anonymous donor. Without this, your daughter would never have completed her program here. She should be proud." I exhaled slowly, my chest tight. "She doesn't remember, or she chooses not to." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Sometimes ambition blinds the young, but the truth has a way of finding its voice." He slid a copy of archived correspondence toward me. There was Evelyn's handwriting again, delicate but firm, in a thank-you note addressed to the scholarship office. It read, "For our daughter, so she may walk further than we ever could." My eyes blurred. I folded the copy carefully, tucking it into my jacket like a shield I would one day need. Later that week, I visited an old friend, Daniel, who had been my foreman in the earliest days of the company. His workshop smelled of sawdust and oil, the familiar rasp of a file on metal filling the air. He looked older now, lines deepened, but his handshake was still strong. "She wants to sell," I told him quietly. "She says the company is nothing but weight. Daniel's jaw clenched. Wait, we bled for that company, Max. You carried it on your back when everyone else quit. And Evelyn, she was there for every moment. Don't let them erase that. I told him about the scholarship, about the documents I had uncovered. He slammed the file shut with a rough hand. That's your truth, Max. Don't hide it. The day will come when you'll need to put it in the open. And when you do, she'll have no ground left to stand on. As I left, the sun was setting, long shadows stretching across the street. I felt heavier but steadier too. The truth was gathering around me piece by piece, a quiet army waiting for its moment. Back at the house, I found my daughter in the living room, poring over glossy brochures of luxury apartments and vacation homes. Her laughter over the phone carried sharp edges like glass breaking. She spoke of deals buyers' percentages. Not once did she mention the legacy behind the walls around her. I stood in the doorway silent, the scholarship receipt burning like a brand against my chest. She thought she was speaking into the future, but I knew she was standing on a foundation she had long forgotten. And I knew when the time came she would see exactly who had built it. The rain had not let up all morning. It streaked across the window in long rivulets as I sat in the kitchen. The scholarship receipt still folded neatly in my pocket. I sipped lukewarm coffee, listening to the tick of the clock and the creak of the old chair beneath me. The house felt quieter than ever, though silence carried its own kind of noise. I thought of Evelyn again, how she used to fill these spaces with warmth, how her laugh could chase away even the darkest storms. Now I carried only echoes and obligations. I knew I couldn't shoulder this truth alone anymore. If my daughter was determined to erase the history of sacrifice, then I needed others to remember it. Others who had seen the early years, who knew what it cost to keep this company alive and our family afloat. By midday, I found myself driving across town to the small law office of an old mentor, Mr. Wallace. He had once been the attorney who helped me draft the very first contracts, when the company was nothing more than a dream scribbled on paper. His office smelled of leather and old files, a kind of place where time seemed to move slower. When I walked in, he looked up, surprise flickering across his face, then softening into something warmer. "Max," he said, standing to shake my hand. "It's been too long. Sit." I lowered myself into the chair across from his desk, feeling suddenly smaller under the weight of memory. I slid the folded receipt across the wood. "Do you remember this, the scholarship, the one that kept my daughter in school?" He picked it up, adjusted his glasses, and nodded almost immediately. "Of course I do. You asked me to keep your name off the records. You said it was her journey to own, not yours." I felt the knot in my chest tighten. She doesn't remember. Or she doesn't care. Now she's talking about selling the company, calling it nothing but a burden. And my voice cracked before I steadied it. I don't know how to make her see. Mr. Wallace leaned back, studying me. "Max, you've spent your life giving. Quietly, selflessly. But there comes a time when the truth must stand, even if it feels like pride. Because it isn't about you, it's about legacy. About Evelyn. About all those sacrifices not being erased." I nodded slowly, feeling both weary and resolute. He pulled a folder from a cabinet and handed it to me. Inside were old documents, contracts, ledgers, letters that bore my name, my signature, the foundation of everything that existed now. "If you need witnesses, Max," he said, his voice firm, "I'll stand with you. I'll tell anyone who asks exactly who built this company and what it cost." Leaving his office, I felt the first flicker of something like hope. Not because the fight was over, but because I knew I wasn't walking into it alone. The rain had stopped and the streets glistened with a damp sheen as if washed clean. That evening I visited the church where Evelyn and I had once sat together in the back pew. Pastor Green was there setting out hymnals, his hands moving with a kind of reverence. He looked up when he saw me, his face breaking into a gentle smile. "Max, it's been too long, my friend." We sat for a while in the quiet sanctuary, the air faint with candle wax and old wood. I told him about the dinner, about my daughter's words, about the scholarship that had been hidden and forgotten. He listened without interruption, his hands folded over his knees. When I finished, he sighed. Children forget the weight their parents carried. But communities remember. I remember seeing you leave this place late at night, still in your work clothes, dirt under your nails after you'd spent the day building, and the evening here volunteering. If your daughter cannot yet see the truth, others will. And when the time comes, they will speak. I swallowed hard, gratitude thick in my throat. He reached over, pressing a hand to my shoulder. Max, when you stand, you will not stand alone. That night, as I walked back into my empty house, the shadows didn't feel as heavy. I could hear the voices of those willing to stand beside me, Mr. Wallace, Pastor Green, even old friends who still remembered the early days. The truth was gathering strength, readying itself for a moment that was coming closer than my daughter could ever imagine. Creak of the floorboards under my feet. I brewed a pot of coffee, strong and bitter, and sat at the kitchen table with a pad of paper. I began writing down names, people who had walked the long road with me. Men who'd worked beside me on cold winter nights, pouring concrete, women in the office who balanced accounts when there was barely enough to keep the lights on, teachers who had seen my daughter walk across the stage because someone me had paid her tuition in silence. One by one, I circled the names that mattered most. Witnesses. Proof. Not just of my sacrifice, but of Evelyn's too, because she was always beside me making dinners out of scraps, stretching every dollar, reminding me that one day it would all be worth it. I started with an old colleague, Henry, who had been my foreman in the early years. His workshop smelled of sawdust and motor oil just as it always had. When he saw me walk in, he raised his eyebrows. Well, if it isn't Max. Been a while, old friend. I told him what had happened at dinner, about my daughter's sharp words, about how she was ready to cash out the company as though it were a lottery ticket, and not a lifetime of work. Henry's face darkened. He poured us 2 cups of coffee and set them on the workbench. I was there when you skipped payroll for yourself to make sure the men got paid, he said firmly. I remember you pulling double shifts, then driving straight to the hospital when Evelyn was sick. If she can't see it, maybe it's time others reminded her. He pulled open a drawer and handed me a battered notebook. Inside were entries he'd kept, job rosters, notes about days when I covered his hours without asking for a dime. Take it, he insisted. Proof doesn't always live in bank accounts. Sometimes it lives in the memories of those who saw you bleed for this place. From Henry's, I drove to the university, the same campus where my daughter had studied. I found Professor Miller gray-haired now, but sharp-eyed as ever. He remembered me instantly. Mr. Anderson, he said, shaking my hand. You're the one who came by quietly each semester making sure tuition was covered. I always admired your humility. I swallowed hard. She doesn't remember, Professor. Or maybe she doesn't want to. He gave me a sympathetic look. Sometimes young people forget the foundation beneath their feet. But records don't forget. I'll dig out the old files, the receipts, the notes from the bursar's office. They'll show exactly where that money came from. You should have had recognition back then, Max, but maybe now is the right time. I left the campus with a manila envelope tucked under my arm, the edges filled with documents that carried weight heavier than words. That evening I sat in my office, Evelyn's photo on the desk beside me, her smile frozen in time. I spread the evidence out in front of me, Henry's notebook, the university receipts, the scholarship confirmation. My hands traced the papers, trembling not from fear, but from something like anticipation. I whispered into the stillness, they want to sell it all, Evelyn. They want to erase what we built, but I won't let them. Not this time. The lamp flickered, and in its dim glow, the papers looked like more than just ink and signatures. They were fragments of truth, waiting to be assembled into a weapon sharper than betrayal. And for the first time in weeks, I felt the scales tipping, not in their favor, but in mine. The next Sunday, the family gathered again around the dining table, as if nothing had been said the week before. The chandelier flickered above us, its old bulbs casting uneven light across the dishes. My daughter came in wearing that confident smile she always wore when she believed the world was bending in her direction. She carried her phone in one hand, scrolling even as she sat down. I let the silence stretch a little longer than usual. The clink of forks against porcelain filled the room. Then softly I slid a folded piece of paper onto the table. It was one of the bursar's receipts, simple, official, undeniable. She glanced at it and frowned. What's this, your tuition? I said, my voice calm. One semester at a time. Paid in full. Her eyes narrowed. Dad, I thought those were scholarships. You always told me not to worry. I told you not to worry because I didn't want you distracted, I replied. But that money didn't come from strangers. It came from long nights overtime, hours and choices your mother and I made. The color drained from her face, but she masked it quickly with indignation. That doesn't change the fact that the company is worth more if we sell. Sacrifice doesn't pay dividends, Dad. Strategy does. The words struck like a blade, but before I could answer, Henry's old notebook slid across the table, too. I'd placed it there earlier, knowing this moment would come. My son-in-law picked it up, flipping through the weathered pages, reading Henry's notes about the times I worked double shifts without pay. He smirked. This is just nostalgia. Who cares what happened 30 years ago? Across the table, my granddaughter looked up from her plate. Her voice was small but clear. Mom, you told me college was because you were smart. But Grandpa, he paid for it. The question froze the room. My daughter tried to laugh it off. Sweetheart, Grandpa is exaggerating. We had scholarships. It's complicated. But children have a way of cutting through lies. She turned back to me, her wide eyes searching. Grandpa, is it true? I nodded, the weight of years pressing against my chest. Yes, darling. Every late night, every overtime shift, it was for you. For your mother's dream, for your future. The spoon slipped from my granddaughter's hand, clattering against the plate. The sound echoed like a gavel in that silent room. For a moment, no one spoke. Then my daughter slammed her napkin down. This isn't fair, Dad. You're trying to guilt us with the past. But this is about the future, about building something bigger. I leaned forward, my voice steady. You confuse bigger with better. Selling off a legacy isn't growth, it's erasure. And one day when the money is gone and the company is nothing but a story, you'll realize that. Her jaw tightened, but her eyes flickered with something doubt, maybe, or fear. She excused herself abruptly, her chair scraping against the wood floor. The room remained heavy with her absence. I sat there with my granddaughter's gaze still on me, wide and knowing. In that moment, I realized something important. The truth was beginning to pierce through, even if only one innocent heart had heard it. And once the truth begins to shine, it's harder to cover it again. 2 days later, I found myself standing at the edge of the old workshop, the place where my company had first begun. The air smelled of sawdust and machine oil, the same scent that clung to me when I used to come home late at night, with calloused hands and aching back. I hadn't stepped inside this building in years, but memories rushed back all at once, the hum of drills, the clatter of steel, the laughter of men who had trusted me to lead them through lean times. I wasn't alone. Beside me stood Thomas, an old colleague, and one of the first men I ever hired. His hair had turned the color of snow, but his handshake was still firm. He looked at me with eyes that carried both loyalty and sorrow. Max, he said, I heard whispers about the board wanting you out. Tell me it isn't true. I sighed and shook my head. It's worse, Thomas. My own daughter wants to sell. She thinks the company is just a ticket to a better life. He clenched his jaw, his hand curling into a fist. Does she know what you gave up, what we all gave up, how you covered payroll with your own mortgage check back in '98? Without you, this company wouldn't have survived its first winter. I pulled from my pocket a folded paper, another receipt, this one from the bank, showing the second mortgage I had taken out to cover those very wages. She knows facts, I said quietly, but she refuses to face the truth. She believes sacrifice is just sentiment, not substance. Thomas laid a hand on my shoulder. Then it's time the truth spoke louder. I'll stand with you. The men who worked here, the families you saved, they'll remember. The workshop door creaked open again, and in came Reverend Matthews, his clerical collar stark against the faded light. He had baptized my daughter when she was a baby, had spoken at my wife's funeral, and had sat with me in the darkest nights when grief threatened to swallow me whole. He looked at the two of us and nodded as if he already knew why he'd been called. Max, he said gently, your wife always believed this company was more than a business. She used to say it was your way of building hope into the world. His eyes softened. If your daughter has forgotten, then perhaps she needs to be reminded, not by argument, but by witness. The words sank into me like a steadying anchor. I thought of my granddaughter's wide eyes at the dinner table, the way truth had cracked the shell of lies just by being spoken plainly. Maybe the same could happen on a larger scale. Maybe the community that had once rallied behind me could rise again, not for profit, but for memory, for sacrifice. I closed my eyes for a moment, hearing echoes of the past. The whine of saws, the smell of sweat and iron, the quiet hum of my wife's encouragement as she brought me dinner in a tin box after midnight shift. She had always said, what you're building isn't just walls. It's a foundation for people. Opening them again, I met both men's eyes. Then we gather witnesses, I said, voice low but firm. If my daughter wants to erase sacrifice, let the people who lived it remind her that it cannot be erased. Thomas's grip tightened on my arm. Reverend Matthews bowed his head in solemn agreement. And in that fading light of the workshop where everything had begun, I felt the stirrings of something stronger than betrayal, the certainty that truth once spoken aloud would carry further than any scheme built on greed. The night before the company's annual gathering, I sat alone in my study with a desk lamp, casting a pale circle of light on the papers spread before me. My hands moved slowly, but with certainty, sorting receipts, scholarship letters, and old photographs into neat piles. These were not just documents. They were chapters of my life, evidence of years that could not be erased by signatures on a sales contract. My daughter thought she was moving pieces on a chessboard, but she had forgotten that I was the one who taught her the game. I lifted one paper and held it closer to the light, a receipt from the university marked paid in full. It was for her tuition during her sophomore year, a semester she remembered as being funded by a mysterious scholarship. She had never asked who was behind it, never cared enough to notice the way I avoided answering when she wondered aloud. Now that slip of paper carried a weight she could not yet understand. Beside the receipts, I had a folder filled with letters from employees and their families. Some had written to me years ago when I quietly covered their medical bills. Others were more recent notes of gratitude for jobs saved during economic downturns. I read them again, letting the words wash over me. You saved my father's job when the factory was closing. You gave us a chance when no one else would. We wouldn't have made it without you. Each line was a piece of armor I would wear the next day. As midnight approached, I closed my eyes and remembered Evelyn's voice, gentle but firm. Max, she used to say, truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be seen. I imagined her standing at my side, steadying me the way she had through every storm. The scholarship I had set up in her name years after her passing now felt like the perfect symbol. It wasn't about money. It was about love given quietly, sacrifice without recognition. That was the story I would bring to light. The next morning, the company hall buzzed with voices. The annual gathering had always been a celebration, but now tension crackled beneath the surface. My daughter sat at the head of the table, her expression sharp, her posture triumphant. Around her were board members, investors, and longtime employees. They expected an announcement of change, perhaps the beginning of a new era. What they did not expect was the weight of memory. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly, feeling the stiffness in my knees, but also the strength in my resolve. I did not look at my daughter first. Instead, I looked at the faces of the men and women who had walked with me through decades of sweat and sacrifice. I let the silence linger, let the air grow heavy. Then, in a voice steady as steel, I said, you wanted to sell the foundation of our lives for a promise of luxury. But this company was never about the cash. It was about the people who built it and the lives it carried. I laid the first receipt on the table, the sound sharp in the hushed room. Then another, and another. Pages that told the real story, not of profit margins, but of sacrifices made so others could stand where they were today. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as eyes widened as recognition dawned. Some of the employees leaned forward, whispering to one another. My daughter shifted in her seat, her confidence flickering like a candle in a draft. And then I reached for the envelope with Evelyn's name. Holding it high, I said, tomorrow at the graduation ceremony, this scholarship, in my wife's honor, will go to a student who thought hope had abandoned them. Because what we build must outlast us, not in wealth, but in legacy. The words struck like a hammer against stone. The room was silent, except for the rustle of papers. My daughter's face paled, and for the first time she looked not victorious, but cornered. The evidence was in my hands. The truth was on the table. The revenge was not anger, it was exposure. That night, as I left the hall, I felt no triumph, only a steady calm. Tomorrow, the world would see what sacrifice truly meant. Tomorrow, her betrayal would meet the weight of truth in front of everyone. The graduation hall was alive with the nervous energy of 100 young lives ready to take flight. The air carried the faint smell of fresh flowers, roses, and lilies arranged on the stage, mixing with the waxy scent of polished wood. The banners of the university hung proudly from the rafters, red and gold, catching the light as if history itself was watching. I sat in the second row with the scholarship envelope pressed firmly between my hands. My daughter was across the aisle, her chin high, her eyes darting toward me with a mixture of suspicion and irritation. She thought she had me figured out, thought today was just another ceremony I would attend in silence. She was wrong. The president of the university began the procession, his voice steady, carrying easily across the auditorium. Names were called, gowns, shuffled tassels swayed as each graduate crossed the stage. The applause rose and fell like waves, steady and predictable. But beneath it all, my heart beat with a rhythm that belonged to a different song. I was not here just to clap politely. I was here to reveal a truth buried too long under pride and betrayal. As the final group of students lined up, the president cleared his throat and announced the presentation of special awards. I stood when he called my name, ignoring the surprised whispers that rolled through the audience. My daughter froze, her fingers tightening around the program in her lap. She had not expected this. She had not planned for this moment. I stepped to the podium, my knees heavy, but my voice clear. I was asked to say a few words. About legacy, I began. Legacy is not about wealth. It is not about selling what was built over a lifetime for a quick profit. Legacy is about sacrifice, about what you give without expecting anything back. The room hushed. Even the shuffling of gowns ceased. I could feel every pair of eyes on me waiting. Slowly, I held up the receipt, yellowed with time but sharp in meaning. 4 years ago, when tuition seemed like an impossible mountain, a scholarship appeared under an anonymous name. Many assumed it was from the university. Some thought it was a benefactor they would never know. Tonight, I tell you the truth. That scholarship came from me. From my wife Evelyn, whose name it carried. From the sacrifices we made quietly because we believed in futures that were not our own. Gasps spread like sparks across the hall. I laid down the receipt on the podium, then another, until the pile grew visible even from the back rows. My daughter's face drained of color, her lips parting but no words emerging. She knew the proof when she saw it. She had lived under its shadow without recognizing the hand that held it. The president's eyes softened as he looked at the documents. "Mr. Thompson," he said quietly, "would you like to present the scholarship yourself?" I nodded and opened the envelope, sliding out a check made out to a student whose family had nearly given up hope. Her name was Maria. I had read her story in the applications. Her father worked 2 jobs, her mother cleaned houses, and still they fell short. I called her name, and she came forward, trembling, tears already glistening in her eyes. Placing the check in her hands, I said, "This is not charity. This is a promise that when one generation sacrifices, the next carries it forward. You are not alone, Maria. You are part of something bigger." The applause was not polite this time. It was thunderous, a wave crashing through the hall, people rising to their feet, clapping until the sound filled every corner. Maria sobbed, clutching the check while her parents wept openly in the audience. I glanced toward my daughter. She sat rigid, her head bowed, her arrogance broken. I turned back to the microphone, and for the first time, I let my voice carry the anger I had held back for months. "You wanted to cash out?" I said, looking directly at her, but this was never about the cash. The silence that followed was heavy, final. The flip line landed with the weight of truth, undeniable and irreversible. The hall erupted again in applause, but this time it was not for me alone. It was for the idea that sacrifice still mattered, that legacy was more than money. As I stepped down from the stage, I felt Evelyn's presence beside me, quiet and proud. The war was no longer mine to fight. The truth had spoken louder than betrayal. The ceremony ended, but the echoes lingered long after the applause faded. The air outside the auditorium was cool and sharp, carrying the faint scent of spring rain on the breeze. Families gathered in clusters, snapping photos, hugging their graduates, laughter rising in bright bursts. Yet as I stepped out into the open, I felt a different kind of attention pressing in on me. People weren't looking at me the way they had an hour ago as just another father in the crowd. They were studying me with respect, with recognition, as though a veil had been lifted. Maria's parents approached first. Her father's hands were calloused, his shirt still carrying the faint marks of long hours at construction sites. He gripped my arm firmly, his voice thick. "Sir, we don't know how to thank you. You didn't just give our daughter a future. You gave us hope back." His wife stood beside him, tears cutting fresh lines across her cheeks, her head nodding in quiet agreement. I simply squeezed his shoulder and said, "Just make sure she carries it forward. That's the only thanks I need." Behind them, a cluster of former students began to gather, faces familiar in flashes. One young man I remembered from years ago. He had been a clerk in my office, working nights to pay tuition. He lifted his chin and said, "Mr. Thompson, I always suspected it was you. You were the only one who ever cared enough to ask how we were doing. Tonight just proved it." His words drew nods from others, a ripple of shared recognition. As their voices rose, I caught sight of a figure hanging back at the edge of the crowd, an old mentor of mine, Professor Harris. He had once guided me through the darkest early years of building the company. His cane tapped the pavement softly as he stepped forward. "Max," he said, his voice worn but steady, "this is what legacy looks like. Not buildings, not bank accounts, but lives shaped because you cared enough to lift them." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking deep. All my life I had measured success in contracts, signed projects, completed numbers written in ledgers. But now, seeing Maria's trembling hands clutching that scholarship, hearing these voices ring out, I understood what Harris meant. The real foundation wasn't cement and steel. It was people. It had always been people. The crowd shifted then, and I noticed my daughter standing stiffly a few yards away. Her arms were crossed, her eyes downcast, but she could not drown out the murmur of approval surrounding me. Her pride had been built on the illusion of ownership of wealth to be cashed out. That illusion was unraveling in real time, thread by thread. Neighbors who had once nodded politely at her were now avoiding her gaze. A young alumna even whispered loudly enough for her to hear she wanted to sell everything. Can you imagine, after what her father gave, each comment was a stone dropping into a pond, the ripples spreading outward? Reputation once lost is hard to recover. I could see it in her rigid stance and the way her jaw tightened. She was realizing that this wasn't just about me anymore. The community had turned. Professor Harris placed a hand on my shoulder and leaned closer. "You see, Max, truth has a way of finding its witnesses. You didn't have to beg for it. You just had to live it. Tonight proved that." His words steadied me, gave me the strength to stand tall amid the shifting currents. As the evening sun dipped lower, casting long golden rays across the campus lawn, more families came forward. They spoke of sacrifices they had made, of nights spent wondering how to keep their children in school, of gratitude that someone like me had reminded them they weren't alone. Each voice added to the chorus, each face another reminder that what I had revealed tonight was bigger than my personal battle. I looked up at the flagpole near the administration building, its banner snapping against the wind. For a fleeting moment I thought of Evelyn. I imagined her hand slipping into mine, her smile quiet but proud, her voice whispering, "This is the legacy we dreamed of." The murmurs around me swelled, not with gossip now, but with solidarity. A line had been drawn. The community was no longer neutral. They had chosen. They had chosen truth over greed. And in that moment, standing among them, I realized the fight was no longer mine alone. It belonged to all of us who still believed that sacrifice mattered, that foundations meant more than profits. My daughter's bowed head told me she knew it too. The days following the ceremony carried a current, that none of us could ignore. It wasn't just whispers anymore, it was open conversation spreading across the community like fire through dry grass. Parents stopped me in the grocery store, their carts half filled, to tell me how the scholarship had reignited their belief in fairness. Old friends called, voices tinged with pride, saying they'd watched the video of Maria receiving her award and felt as if justice itself had stood tall that night. Each interaction reminded me that what had been hidden in shadows for years was finally out in the light, undeniable and unshakable. I began to notice how the university itself responded. An email landed in my inbox, formal yet warm, from the dean's office. They wanted to honor Evelyn and me at the upcoming alumni banquet, acknowledging not just the scholarship, but a lifetime of quiet contributions. The message struck a chord. For years, Evelyn and I had spoken about the importance of giving back, of building something larger than ourselves. Now her name would be etched into the institution's story, not just as my wife, but as a symbol of what we both believed in. Meanwhile, the shift in my daughter's world was just as swift, but far harsher. Where once she had commanded attention with her confident tone and promises of selling the company for a better life, she now found herself isolated. Board members who had nodded in agreement before now avoided her calls. A colleague even confided to me that investors were uneasy, murmuring about her judgment and lack of respect for legacy. The very foundation she thought she could flip for profit was crumbling beneath her, while my footing, quiet, steady, built on years of sacrifice, only grew firmer. Yet amid all this, my focus never strayed from Maria. The glow in her eyes at that ceremony stayed with me. I visited her family a week later, bringing over Evelyn's old cookbook. I placed it in her mother's hands, telling her this held the recipes of our family dinners. "Maybe it can serve yours now." She clutched it close, tears brimming, and Maria whispered, "I'll make you something from it when I graduate." It was a promise, fragile yet radiant, that tied the past and the future together. Still, there was a tension in the air I couldn't ignore. My daughter had not spoken to me since that night. She hadn't come to my home, hadn't called, not even sent an email. Pride can build walls faster than any mason, and yet beneath the silence I sensed a storm brewing. Shame, once ignited, rarely settles quietly. One evening I found myself back at the campus, walking the dimly lit halls alone. The echo of my steps mingled with distant voices of students still awake, still studying, still dreaming. On a bulletin board pinned between posters for clubs and tutoring sessions was a flyer thanking anonymous donors for supporting underprivileged students. My gaze lingered on those words. Anonymous donors. That had been me for years. And now, for the first time, anonymity had been stripped away, leaving behind not humiliation, but honor. As I left the building, the night air crisp around me, I realized the truth. What had been revealed couldn't be undone. My daughter's attempt to erase sacrifice had backfired, leaving the evidence of love and legacy stronger than ever. And though the community now knew the story, I sensed the real reckoning with her had yet to come. The silence between my daughter and me finally broke on a morning that felt heavy even before the sun had fully risen. A board meeting had been scheduled, one I hadn't planned to attend, but word reached me that she intended to use the session to push for the sale of the company once again. Something inside me told me this would not be just another attempt at persuasion. This was her last stand, and it was time for me to face her openly, not as a father quietly wounded, but as a man whose legacy could no longer be dismissed. When I walked into the boardroom, a hush fell. The long mahogany table stretched before me, its polished surface reflecting the anxious faces of colleagues I had known for decades. Some avoided my eyes. Others offered small nods as if to say they knew more now than they had before. At the far end, my daughter sat tall in her chair, papers spread before her, voice sharp as she launched into a speech about modernization, about shedding the weight of the past, about selling the company to step into the future. I let her finish, every word cutting deeper. But when she leaned back, satisfied with the silence that followed, I stood. My hands rested firmly on the table, and I spoke slowly, each word deliberate, steady, leaving no room for interruption. I reminded them all how the company had been built not on quick deals or empty promises, but on nights of missed meals, on hands blistered from work, on the sacrifices Evelyn and I had made long before any of them knew what the name of our business meant. Then I reached into my jacket pocket. The room seemed to hold its breath as I pulled out the folded receipts, the records of the scholarship I had quietly funded, the investment in young lives that had never been about profit, but about potential. I laid them down on the table for all to see. My voice dropped lower, but carried stronger. You speak of stepping into the future, I told her, but you cannot sell what was never bought. This company was founded on sacrifice, and its true value is measured in lives, changed not in a balance sheet. She shifted in her chair, her confidence flickering. Someone at the table cleared their throat, another leaned forward to study the papers. The tide was turning not because I shouted louder, but because the truth now stood in plain sight. My daughter tried to respond, her tone brittle. She spoke of opportunity of investors lined up with the chance to escape what she called old ways. But her words no longer carried the same weight. The board members had seen the proof. They had witnessed where the heart of the company truly lay. By the time the meeting ended, nothing had been decided formally, but something far more powerful had shifted. The authority she once commanded had thinned, her arguments unraveling under the weight of sacrifice revealed. And as I walked out of that room, the papers still resting on the table, I knew this was not just a battle for a company. It was a battle for memory, for legacy, for the truth of a life that could not be erased by ambition. That evening when I returned home, the house felt different. Not lighter, not yet, but steadier. I set the empty chair across from me, the one Evelyn once filled, and whispered into the quiet, "We're not done yet. But they're starting to see." The following week brought with it a weight I could feel in my chest, though my steps remained steady. Word of the boardroom clash had spread further than I expected. Old colleagues called. A former mentor, now retired, reached out and asked if I would meet him. I agreed, unsure what good it would do, but when I walked into the coffee shop and saw his familiar frame bent slightly over a steaming cup, I felt a strange mix of comfort and sorrow. He rose when he saw me, his hand still firm, his eyes sharp with memory. "Max," he said, his voice carrying both warmth and gravity, "I heard what your daughter tried to do. And I also heard what you revealed." He tapped the folder at his side. "Do you think I didn't know? You think I never realized who funded those scholarships? You kept it quiet, but I watched the checks arrive. I watched students graduate who would never have stepped foot in college without you." I sat, my throat tightening. For years I had hidden those acts, believing the quiet road was nobler, that recognition wasn't the point. But here was a man who knew, who had seen, who now stood ready to speak. "It's time people heard the truth," he said firmly. "It's time they understand this company wasn't built for selling. It was built for giving." Later that evening, another voice joined in. Pastor Williams stopped by my house, his frame tall in the doorway, carrying with him the soft smell of incense from the church. He didn't waste words. He laid a hand on my shoulder and said, "You stood for sacrifice, Max. I'll stand beside you when the time comes." Their support carried me into the next gathering, a larger one. The community hall buzzed with low voices and the shuffle of chairs as people took their seats. My daughter arrived late, her presence commanding, but strained, her eyes darting toward me with unspoken tension. I held her gaze just long enough to let her know I wasn't afraid. When the floor opened, it was not I who spoke first. It was my mentor. He stood and recounted the story of anonymous scholarships of young men and women lifted by unseen hands. His words painted pictures no financial argument could erase, faces of students' families forever changed. Then the pastor rose and added his voice, reminding everyone that legacy was not about profit margins, but about lives touched. I remained seated, my hands clasped, my heart pounding as their words filled the room. For once, I didn't need to defend myself. Others carried the truth forward, and I saw heads nod. I heard murmurs of agreement. I felt the shift. The foundation was being laid for what was to come. When I finally stood, the silence was immediate. I looked at my daughter, then at the community gathered, and I said, "Simply, you called this company a chance to cash out. But what you call cash, I call sacrifice. What you call outdated, I call promise." I let the words hang in the air. They were not shouted. They were not wrapped in anger. They were carved from years of truth. As the meeting adjourned, I walked out into the cool night air. The stars above seemed sharper, clearer, as if Evelyn herself had brushed them back into place. My allies had spoken. My truth had begun to spread. And though the final confrontation had yet to come, I could feel the ground shifting beneath us all. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept without waking in the dark, my breath steady, my heart sure. The battle wasn't over, but I was no longer fighting it alone. The day of reckoning arrived with the kind of clarity I hadn't felt in months. The university auditorium was alive with movement graduates in robes lined up, nervously proud parents filled the rows, and the banners of legacy hung from the rafters. I walked in quietly, no longer carrying the title of founder, no longer seated in the place reserved for board members, but holding something stronger than position, the truth that had waited years to be revealed. My daughter was already there, her posture rigid, her eyes darting across the room as though the walls themselves might whisper what she had tried to hide. I didn't speak to her. There would be time for that later. For now, I focused on the envelope in my hand, heavy, not just with the check it carried, but with the name written across it, Evelyn Memorial Scholarship. The ceremony began, the usual parade of speeches and congratulations. I listened as administrators spoke of excellence and resilience, their words painting the air with pride. Yet I knew what was coming, and I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. When my name was called, there was a murmur, a shifting in the seats. Some hadn't expected me here. Some thought I had walked away after the boardroom humiliation. But I stood steady and stepped to the podium. The microphone caught the tremor in my first breath, but then my voice settled into the rhythm of a man who had carried both burden and blessing for a lifetime. Years ago I believed education could change the course of a life. I believed it so strongly that I gave quietly, anonymously, because it wasn't about recognition. It was about opportunity. Tonight I want to tell you something I never said aloud. The scholarships that carried many of you, the checks that made dreams possible, did not come from a faceless institution. They came from someone who sat where you sit once dreaming of a better life. They came from me. Gasps rippled through the audience. I could feel my daughter's stare like heat on the back of my neck. I reached into the folder and lifted the old receipts, the signed slips, proof of years of sacrifice hidden in plain sight. This company, this legacy, was never meant to be cashed out. It was meant to be given forward. And tonight I continue that promise. I opened the envelope and held up the new scholarship check, the name of my late wife shining across it. In Evelyn's memory, this will go to a student who dreams as fiercely as she once did. Because money isn't the measure of life. Legacy is. Applause thundered, not polite, but rising, sustained, carrying the weight of recognition that had been denied me too long. I stepped back from the podium and handed the envelope to the dean, who held it as reverently as if it were a torch. I didn't look at my daughter then, but I could feel the silence that fell over her, the way pride and shame collided inside her chest. The confrontation wasn't finished, but the stage had shifted. The truth had left my lips and entered the world where it could not be taken back. As I returned to my seat, I felt Evelyn beside me, her hand on mine, her voice in the roar of applause. I whispered to myself, almost without realizing, you wanted to cash out. This was never about the cash. And the crowd, though they didn't hear, seemed to echo the sentiment in every clap of their hands, every tear that shimmered in the light. The applause still echoed in my ears as I stepped down from the stage, but I could feel the weight of silence that followed me back to my seat. My daughter sat stiffly, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't clap. She didn't look at me. For a moment I saw the child she once was, the little girl who had run to me with scraped knees and tearful eyes, who once whispered, "Daddy, you're my hero." But that image was fractured now, replaced by the hardened woman who had told me to sell everything we built to trade sacrifice for luxury. I sat down, folded my hands, and let the sound of the crowd wash over me. The dean took the podium again, his voice reverent. Tonight we not only honor our graduates, but we honor a man who has lived the very principle this institution was founded upon, that education is not a privilege of the few, but a gift to be shared. Mr. Maxwell Harris, your generosity has shaped countless lives, and now with the Evelyn Memorial Scholarship it will shape countless more. The audience rose to their feet. The applause returned louder this time, more purposeful. I kept my eyes forward, not searching for her reaction, but the sound pressed down on my daughter like judgment. I saw her shoulders slump, her chin tremble. Her husband touched her arm, whispering something I couldn't hear, but she pulled away, shaking her head. Behind me, a voice murmured, "I knew it. I always knew he was the one." I turned slightly and saw a professor I hadn't spoken to in years, tears shining in her eyes. A graduate nearby whispered to his mother, "That's the man who paid for my last semester." These weren't stage testimonials. These were real voices, voices that carried the truth I had carried alone for too long. I noticed her then, my daughter, rising from her chair. The applause was still ongoing, but she couldn't bear it. Her heels clicked against the wooden floor as she moved quickly down the aisle, her face half hidden by her hair. People turned to watch, some frowning, some whispering. She kept her head down, her body stiff, as if trying to escape, not just the room, but the weight of her own choices. The moment carved itself into memory, the standing ovation swelling behind me, my daughter walking away in silence, the scholarship envelope glowing in the dean's hand. One image of pride, another of shame, split side by side like the final verdict of a trial. I remained seated. I didn't chase her. I didn't need to. This wasn't a victory for me, not in the way boardrooms or contracts had once defined success. It was a victory for every sacrifice that had been dismissed, every late night I had worked to cover tuition, every whispered promise I had made to Evelyn that her dreams for our child would never die. The crowd began to quiet, the applause tapering into reverent stillness. The dean gestured toward me again, inviting me to stand, but I stayed where I was. I had said what I came to say. I had given what I came to give. Now the truth belonged to them. My daughter's absence left a hollow space in the room, but it was filled almost instantly by something larger, a sense of community that recognized sacrifice, honored it, and refused to let it be erased. In that moment, I understood her shame was her burden to carry, but my legacy was already secure. The ceremony pressed on, but I hardly heard the words. I felt Evelyn in every cheer, every nod, every hand pressed over a heart in gratitude. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. After the ceremony closed, I found myself surrounded by faces, neighbors, colleagues, even strangers who had come to witness the graduates but were now drawn to me. The hall hummed with conversation, but every thread seemed to weave back to one truth: they had seen what my daughter tried to bury, and they weren't about to let it vanish. A retired professor stepped forward first, his cane tapping against the wooden floor. "Max," he said, voice trembling with age, but steady with conviction, "I was there the day you signed that first check. You didn't want your name attached, but I knew. I knew it was you. You saved a dozen students that year. Some of them became doctors, teachers, mothers, fathers. That's a legacy money can't buy." His hand gripped mine firm despite the years. Behind him came a young man in his cap and gown, still flushed from his walk across the stage. "Sir," he said, holding his diploma like a fragile treasure, "I never would made it through without that scholarship. I didn't know it came from you. Tonight, I finally do. Thank you for everything." His mother stood beside him, tears streaking her face, whispering prayers of gratitude as she reached for my hand. The pastor from our old church stepped into the circle, his deep voice carrying above the crowd. "This community has always known your sacrifice, Max. We've spoken of it in whispers in small groups, but tonight it was shouted from the rooftops. You are not a burden. You are the foundation." The words struck like an echo of what I had waited to hear, a balm to wounds carved by betrayal. I caught sight of my daughter lingering near the exit, her face pale, her eyes darting nervously as she realized the tide had turned. She wasn't the center of admiration anymore. The applause hadn't been for her dream of selling the company, of chasing luxuries. It was for the sacrifices she had chosen to forget. She shifted uncomfortably, the weight of unspoken judgment pressing on her shoulders before slipping away into the night. But others stayed, and they came closer. A nurse whose tuition I had once covered after her father's accident. A lawyer who confessed he'd been on the verge of dropping out before that anonymous check appeared. Each story layered onto the last. A chorus of voices that built something stronger than any accusation. These weren't rehearsed speeches. They were raw, unpolished truths, spoken from hearts that had been touched without knowing the hand that helped them. I stood quietly in the center of it all, my heart both heavy and light. Heavy with the loss of a daughter who could not see past her own ambition, but light with the undeniable confirmation that Evelyn's memory had not been betrayed. She had always wanted me to plant seeds, even if we never saw the trees. Tonight those trees stood tall and the lives gathered around me. The dean returned, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Max," he said, his voice steady and public, "this school owes you more than thanks. We owe you a place in our history. Tonight isn't just about honoring the students. It's about honoring the man who made their journey possible." Applause swelled again, but this time it wasn't the ceremonial kind. It was communal, alive, born from genuine recognition. I could feel the difference in the sound. It wasn't polite clapping. It was the sound of hearts aligning, of a truth no longer hidden. I lowered my head, overcome, and for a moment I imagined Evelyn standing just behind me, her hand on my shoulder, whispering the words I longed to hear. "Now they know." When the last applause faded and the hall emptied, I walked slowly into the night air. The campus lights glowed like lanterns along the path, guiding my steps back to the car. The cool air carried the faint scent of lilacs blooming near the courtyard, the same kind of flowers Evelyn once loved to press between the pages of her Bible. I paused there, taking in the quiet, letting the echoes of the evening settle in my chest. The drive home was silent except for the hum of the tires on the road. The town passed by in familiar snapshots, the diner where Evelyn and I had celebrated small victories, the park where I once taught my daughter to ride her bike, the church steeple rising in the distance. Each place had held meaning once, but tonight they felt different, less burdened by grief, more illuminated by what had just unfolded. At home, I unlocked the door and stepped into the stillness. The faint creak of the floorboards greeted me like an old friend whispering, "You're not alone." I set my coat on the chair and lingered in the living room. The photographs on the wall seemed to glow faintly in the lamplight. There was Evelyn holding our daughter at graduation. There was me, hammer in hand, building the porch with sweat dripping down my brow. And in the center, the wedding photo, our promise framed in silver. I sat in my chair. The one Evelyn used to say was too worn for guests, but perfect for me. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the small journal I kept hidden in the drawer. Its leather cover was cracked from years of use. Inside, Evelyn's handwriting filled the first pages, prayers for our daughter, hopes for our family, gratitude for every simple blessing. Her words were soft reminders that sacrifice had always been love in action. I lit a candle on the mantel. The flame flickered, casting shadows that danced across the room. For a moment I felt her presence there, as if she were sitting quietly beside me. I whispered into the silence, "They finally know, Evelyn. They finally see what we gave, what we built. Our story isn't erased." The air seemed to answer with warmth. I closed the journal and leaned back, breathing deeply. Tonight was not just about what I had lost. It was about what had been revealed. A community now carried the truth. The seeds we planted had grown, and the roots would hold even if family blood had failed me. I thought of my daughter walking away from the ceremony, her head lowered, pride fractured. The image hurt, but it also felt like a door closing. Some chapters are written in sorrow so that others can be written in hope. I couldn't control her choices, but I could honor Evelyn's memory and the life we had built together. That was my promise, one I would keep until my last breath. I poured myself a small glass of wine and raised it toward Evelyn's photograph. The candlelight shimmered across the glass. "To you, my love," I whispered. "To what we gave and to what will endure." The house was quiet, but it no longer felt hollow. It felt steady, filled with something invisible yet undeniable. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth of the candle and the hum of memory hold me. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and it sounded almost like applause, gentle, continuous, affirming. Now they knew. The following morning, I rose to the sound of soft knocking at the front door. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting golden stripes across the worn wooden floor. For a moment, I thought it was just another delivery, maybe mail or groceries, but when I opened the door, the sight made my throat tighten. A small group of neighbors stood there, some still in work clothes, others holding folded programs from last night's ceremony. Behind them, Reverend Daniel stood quietly, his hands clasped, his eyes steady with the kind of understanding that only comes from years of shepherding broken souls. "Max," he said gently, "we wanted to stop by." They filed in, slowly filling the living room with the hum of voices and the scent of morning coffee someone had carried in a thermos. Mrs. Callahan, who lived down the street, placed a plate of biscuits on the table as if she'd been waiting for a reason to share kindness. Mr. Alvarez, my old co-worker from the factory, clapped me on the shoulder with a firm hand that said more than words could. For a long while, no one spoke directly about what had happened. Instead, they talked around it, the weather, the spring blooms, the latest repairs on the church roof. Yet beneath it all was an unspoken thread. They were here because they had seen, and they would not let me carry the weight alone. Finally, Reverend Daniels broke the silence. Max last night reminded us all of something bigger than pride or property. You gave when you didn't have to. You built when others were content to take. That's a legacy no vote, no sale, no betrayal can erase. My hands curled in my lap. I felt the tremor return, that same one from the night at the dinner table when the words first cut me. But this time the tremor wasn't fear. It was release. Mr. Alvarez leaned forward. We want to help maintain the scholarship fund. My grandson starts college next fall. He told me this morning he wants to honor your wife's name in his application essay. Said it's the least he can do. The room stirred with murmurs of agreement. Mrs. Callahan added softly, your Evelyn's name will live on Max. You've made sure of it. I swallowed hard, staring at the flicker of candlelight, still glowing faintly on the mantel from the night before. Evelyn would have smiled at this neighbor's gathered community knitting itself closer in the wake of truth. Then I noticed something I hadn't expected. At the edge of the group near the doorway, my daughter stood. She hadn't knocked, hadn't announced herself. Her head was lowered, hair falling across her face, but I could see the redness around her eyes. She didn't speak, only placed a folded note on the table, the handwriting shaky but familiar. Without a word, she turned and left. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I let the weight of the moment sink in, the neighbor's presence, the reverend's quiet affirmation, the fragile gesture from my child. As the morning stretched on the house filled with warmth, not from fire or candle, but from people choosing to stand with me. They carried Evelyn's legacy as if it were their own, and in that I felt something I hadn't in months. I wasn't just surviving betrayal, I was surrounded by proof that love and sacrifice still mattered. When the last of them left, the note remained on the table. I picked it up, the paper, trembling between my fingers. 3 words stared back at me in my daughter's script. I am sorry. I closed my eyes, the sound of the front door still echoing faintly in my ears, and whispered into the stillness she finally knows. The evening was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles after a storm has passed. Max moved slowly through the house, each step measured as though he were walking not just through rooms but through memories. The folded note from his daughter was still tucked safely inside his shirt pocket, close to his heart. He paused at the mantel where Evelyn's framed photograph rested beside a small vase of fresh flowers. With steady hands, he lit a thin stick of incense, the smoke rising in gentle curls, carrying with it the scent of sandalwood. The flame caught, glowing softly as if even the air wanted to remember her. Max bowed his head. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the words carried through the stillness. Evelyn, they know now. They all know. The sacrifices weren't forgotten. The love we built, it outlived betrayal. A draft moved the curtains, making the candlelight tremble. He looked toward the window where the faint sound of laughter drifted in from the street neighbors, lingering children, playing life, carrying forward. And for the first time in a long while, Max allowed himself a gentle smile. He touched the edge of the frame, fingers resting on Evelyn's face. I kept my promise, he said softly. And tonight our story ends, not in bitterness but in truth. Max sat quietly for a moment longer, letting the incense burn down, letting the silence cradle him. Then, with a deep breath, he turned toward the camera, his eyes filled with the calm of a man who had carried his burden and finally set it down. Thank you, my friends, for listening to this story, he said. Thank you for walking this path with me, for remembering that sacrifice matters, and that truth, no matter how heavy, will always find its way to the light. I wish you and your families health, love, and peace. Until next time, take care of one another. And remember, his hand tapped gently on his heart. Now they know. The screen faded slowly, leaving only the warm glow of the candles and the lingering whisper of smoke curling upward.